Okay, well, if you've tuned in, perhaps you're wondering about Nephi's profession. Who is this famous person? Well, I thought it would be good to guess about Nephi's profession because it should also be a rewarding exploration through ancient culture as well. So at the end, I definitely want your ideas on what other professions Nephi may have had. Based on what we know, one might think Nephi is a lawyer or a merchant, a warrior, a metalsmith, or a scribe. But let's talk about a few of those. One might think Nephi is a lawyer based on his narration of the homicide of Laban. Jack Welch, who's a professor of law, notes how Nephi's narration constitutes a legal defense and has similarities with other homicide narrations in the Bible. So I think that's fine, but keep in mind the account we have wasn't written until decades later, and so Nephi would have had time to talk with others and to really develop his narration. So some of the features certainly suggest knowledge of Judean law, such as specifying the weapon was not made of iron and specifying he didn't lay in wait. However, I don't think only a lawyer could have written that brings us to another point. We are fairly certain that Nephi wrote in Demotic script, Demotic Egyptian. So this is in part from the misnamed Anthem transcript that you see here. Other examples of Demotic Egyptian at the time show that the language was used in legal and merchant transactions. So since Nephi could write in Demotic, it's likely he had experience similar to perhaps a notary or a paralegal. Now, recall that the scriptures seem hard to find in Jerusalem, and it's this time that Nephi only knows about one copy that's kept by Laban. Also, this is the time King Josiah is rebuilding the temple and rediscovers the law. So it's safe to say that Nephi's scribal training was perhaps developed in a secular field. Now, learning Egyptian is nothing trivial. There's over 800 described hieroglyphs, so it's a great amount of training for Nephi. And that brings us to another question. How old is Nephi? His training possibly suggests multiple vocations. You might recall that Nephi says he was exceedingly young, but large in stature. People, including myself, seem to think that means he's barely past puberty. Why else would you put those two terms together? But there's another data point we're not using. That's from Jacob. Jacob writes that 55 years after leaving Jerusalem, Nephi began to be old. So to me, this suggests that Nephi's age is perhaps a decade less than the normal life expectancy. And if we read in the book of Tobit, we'll find that a person in northern Israel, about 100 years before Nephi lived, died at the age of 117. Also, the Book of Mormon seems to count one generation as 100 years. So it's safe to say it's even a conservative guess that Nephi is 100 years old when he dies, which would put him at 45 about the time he leaves Jerusalem. Now recall that Enoch calls himself a lad at age 65, and that certainly makes this theory plausible. But we still have the issue of the stature. It seems Nephi has barely arrived at the age of full stature, and given that puberty has decreased by about 3 years in just the last 100 years, it's hard to say when growth spurts and puberty was taking place around 600 BC. So we could probably look into that more, but to be sure, I'm not saying Nephi was 45, but I think it's reasonable to think he's older than 18. And so it may be possible that Nephi had time for changing or perhaps multiple professions. So we were talking about scribes and how they have a role in legal documents or transaction receipts. Just as an example, here's a divorce certificate in Demotic Egyptian from about 500 BC. As you can see, it's signed, or it's not signed, it just merely concludes with the scribe's name. So this is important because the Egyptian word for scribe has been found in Israel, and it dates to Nephi's time. So as you can see, the scribe merely writes what is happening about the divorce, and then he writes his name. Think of the significance. Perhaps it suggests there's not a lot of literacy, as there seems to be minimal concern for fraud. Centuries later, this document would look like this, which is similar, but there's several signatures on the back. It seems around Nephi's time, the scribe is essentially the witness. No wonder they also have that appellation at times anciently. So aside from the scribe or legal or paralegal administrative connection, others have guessed that there's a scribe and metalsmith connection. You can search on the Interpreter website for terms, Nephi and scribal schools, and you'll find that. Obviously, we know some important records were kept on copper or gold anciently. Examples include copper plates used by the Jews in Conch in India, or the gold records buried under ancient temples such as this one. Now, it makes sense that scribes would learn to make their own writing material. So I don't really have any problem with Nephi being a metalsmith and a scribe as well. But there are a few questions we have not addressed. Why steel? Nephi grades and works in steel. Steel's probably too hard to use as a writing material. Okay, also, why does Lehi have so many camels and tents? Recall, they left Jerusalem furtively, so it may be that they didn't want to make noticeable purchases. And now perhaps Lehi is a traveling diplomat, or he must not be too important because Laban thinks he can kill Nephi without much repercussion. So perhaps they are merchants. But Another thing I've always wondered about is why no one raided Lehi's house. Does that mean they had trusted servants, or perhaps they live in a way that no one knows they are gone? Since Nephi goes up to Jerusalem, the topography suggests that he doesn't live in the actual city. Perhaps they have a house with their own wall that provides safety and privacy. So please let me know what you think of that. I've always wondered why it is that Lehi is able to leave his house and his wealth isn't stolen. Okay, so far we have a scribe type person who perhaps has some legal or administrative training, often traveling. They have some metal experience. Now, in case you don't know, archaeologists have found over 10,000 mines and mine-related sites in the Timnah Valley that date to Solomon's time. So that's only 100 miles from Jerusalem. There's presumably many reasons for traveling and dealing in metal. But that brings us to a new question. We haven't discussed Nephi's steel bow. Is he a trained archer? Also, why does he have a steel bow? Perhaps Nephi made it. That may explain why his brothers seem to have wood bows. Now, also, Nephi grades steel on occasion. He says his bow is made of fine steel, and he says Laban's sword is the most precious steel. So this is something else that suggests Nephi has a good deal of knowledge about steel. So he also tends to give God credit when God teaches him things, yet Nephi never talks about God giving him knowledge with metalsmithing. Rather, Nephi's question to God is, where do I get ore to make tools, not how do I make tools? So this brings us to something that was formerly controversial. Did the Jews have access to steel? Well, archaeology has answered that for us. Yes, they did. Even steel swords have been found in Israel that date to that time. But actually, we can learn a lot more about Judean culture if we read about the language patterns. So this is a linguistic study from Dr. Levine. It's published in the Jewish Quarterly Review. And it's about steel, of course. I can only scratch the surface here. But here he cites an ancient Hebrew script that writes about Nebuchadnezzar. He sent 300 mules of axes made of iron that prevails over iron. Keep in mind, steel is iron, and it just has a little bit of carbon infused. Perhaps then, iron that prevails over iron is a reference to steel. At least that's what the author is suggesting. Another text in Jeremiah 15:2 is similar. It asks, can a man break iron? Then it clarifies, iron from the north. So is that a different type of iron, or is that steel like we're talking about? Also, the author suggests Ezekiel 27:19 makes mention of steel because it talks about bright iron or worked iron. So if we accept this at face value, then it seems that while steel exists, and the Jews know about steel, it also seems uncommon. The soldiers' weapons perhaps are made of iron. Why else would the reader care that the axes break iron? And we also see that the Judeans don't seem to have a word for steel, and they talk about it as if it's coming from the north. I forgot to say in that verse from Ezekiel that it's discussing that the bright or worked iron is from the northern city of Tyre. So keep in mind that Jeremiah and Ezekiel are addressing Jews. So this suggests the listeners do know about steel, or this sort of refined or purified iron, or worked iron. And so at least steel seems to be available in Israel as an import, but I do think it'd be tough to make a case that steel is very common in Israel. So how does that apply to Nephi? Well, if Lehi has steel and it's a rare commodity, it's no wonder Laban is lusting after it. But there's a new question here. If Nephi is a sort of traveling metalsmith scribe, who is teaching him about steel, and why are they teaching him? As we said, steel is probably too hard to write on. And also the expertise doesn't seem to exist see two possibilities here. Either Lehi is associated with a new sort of guild of some sort in Jerusalem, or perhaps he has connections with northern cities like Tyre and Nephi is learning there. Now, knowledge of steel would certainly explain Lehi's status as a sort of wealthy immigrant family in Judah. Keep in mind his fathers lived in northern Israel, which is why I'm describing him as an immigrant. So either Nephi has multiple vocations, or perhaps Nephi's family is some sort of steel merchant. That would definitely explain the need for a scribe that can record transactions, that can also assess the quality of steel. All right, lastly, I should point out that Nephi mentions his treasures as our gold and our silver and our precious things. Read as a list, this seems to suggest precious refers to something besides gold and silver. The idea that steel is more precious than gold is also alluded to in the description of Laban's sword. Remember, it's the steel that is described as most precious, not the gold. So perhaps indeed Lehi has pieces of steel, and that's what Laban is lusting over. The majority of the collection, though, probably gold and silver, which is why it was described that way. So there's plenty more to think about. Let's revisit a list. Steel merchant seems to be a vocation that includes traveling, language, and scribal skills, ability in both traditional metalsmith and steel production. What other professions can you think of so far that touches on all these skills we mentioned? There is, though, another piece that I should mention, and aside from possibly making his own bow, Nephi seems very competent at weapon usage. He even notes the need for new arrows with a different bow. So his competence could be a result of military training, but perhaps Nephi is also an armed guard as he moves family shipments of steel through the region. That's what I think fits. Such a profession could certainly account for Lehi's wealth and his status as an accepted immigrant. So why do I care? I care about this because it kind of reframes how I see Nephi. Nephi had to reinvent himself and become a spiritual leader himself. That is part of the journey that I think we miss a lot and we may not appreciate. Also, I think we can kind of read between the lines in Nephi's text and we could consider perhaps he has a grudge against the Jewish elders, and at times he explicitly blames them for the destruction of Jerusalem. So more on that next time. But let me know your thoughts and what else did everyone think? What did I miss? And what other vocations do you think would fit with all these puzzle pieces? What vocations did Nephi have pre-exile? Thanks much. Until next time.